Welcome to Podcast T, which is a podcast that has questions that deal with joint cost allocations. We'll be doing two questions or parts thereof in this podcast, so it will be slightly shorter than other podcasts that have been done to date. We'll start with problem 8.4. Problem 8.4, Mystic Herbs, deals with a joint process that processes a root found in the Australian rainforest into 4 joint processes. Now, part B, which we'll start with, is about the decision to process the root further. To maximize the value of the joint products, the question on the table is which of them should be processed further and which should be sold without processing. Now, the decision to process further, of course, is one where you use relevant costing or incremental costing, a subject that you spent some time on in RSM 222 and we've spent a little time on in our RSM 322 in capital budgeting. It's known as marginal or incremental costing or relevant costing, are all synonyms for this technique. Now, the decision to process further is based on the incremental revenue minus the incremental cost. In the case of the Shavonic root, the 4 joint processes, or 4 joint products, each have different revenues from processing further, the highest being the revenue associated with HM4, the lowest being the revenue associated with VX7. The number of ounces you can get from a batch of each is listed. The highest number of ounces comes from the LZ9 and the lowest with VX7. Now, the incremental revenue from processing further then in total is the highest under LZ9 at $2,730. The cost of processing further is $2,400 in the case of QB3, which exceeds the incremental revenue of $2,300. The cost of 640 in VX7 exceeds, or the incremental revenue of 640 in VX7 exceeds the cost of further processing of 400, so we do decide to process that further, even though it makes a very small amount of income per batch. It is still a positive 240. HM4 has incremental revenue of 3125, which exceeds the cost of processing further. It too will be processed further. But LZ9 will be sold without further processing as the costs of further processing exceed the incremental revenues. So 2 of the 4 joint products should be processed further. The other 2 should be sold the way they are. Now, in part C, the question is that based on your analysis, should the processing occur? And when you take a look at the revenue from further processing or immediate sale, you end up with a net realizable value in total of $32,900, only ending up with a joint cost of processing of $30,000 a batch. Remember that the cost of further processing in the case of QB3 and LZ9 are 0 because we decided not to process them further. The joint cost of processing a batch are $30,000, so the profit per batch is maximized at $2,900. Now, The next question on the table is, do joint cost allocations contribute information helpful in making the decision to allocate joint products? And I think the answer quite clearly is that joint cost allocations do not enhance the decision to process further joint products. They are done because GAAP requires it. Net realizable value does not harm the decision process, but it doesn't add anything. The decisions in Part B to process each joint product further or sell after the split-off point were made without any joint cost allocations whatsoever. So no matter what technique you use to do the joint allocation that's necessary for GAAP purposes, that allocation is not useful and will not enhance your decision-making ability about whether to process the products further. Now we'll move on to one more problem on joint products, 8.6. Now in product 8.6, we have two joint products using a common input again, and the question is, again, if the selling prices at the split-off point are, before further processing, $35 and $1 per pound of X and V, what should the firm do about further processing? So let's take a look. The further processing depends again on incremental revenue. The revenues from the products are $8,000 and $4,000 individually, and if each batch has a joint cost of $8,000 plus additional processing costs of $5,200, a cost of $13,200, and each batch generates $12,000, thereby producing a loss right now of $1,200. Now, currently the firm is losing money processing the joint products. Each batch has a joint cost. So we're going to take a look at what the optimal decisions are using incremental costing. Using incremental costing, the decision should be to sell X but process Y further. And if X is sold and V is processed, the net receipts are -$400. So the best that the firm can do is to lose $400 on a batch. The question of whether a firm can make money by purchasing intermediate products X and Y in the market and processing them further reveals that the net realizable value from processing X is 31, the price of the intermediate good is 35. For V, the net realizable value from additional processing is at $1.50. The price of the intermediate products are $1. So if these prices are expected to persist, the firm should stop buying the common input and separating it into X and Y. Rather, it should buy the intermediate product V for $1 and process it into a final product. V can be purchased for $1, processed into a final product for $8.50, and sold for a 50-cent profit. If they decide to continue at $35 without further processing, or if they decide to continue to process the joint products, then to minimize their losses, X should be sold at $35 without further processing, but V should be processed further, as that minimizes their loss. And those are the two problems for joint cost allocations that we'll do right now under topic D. Trying to decide from an economic perspective whether we should process further or sell at the split off point. So the next podcast is should be podcast E, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast.